Everybody, it's Rick, and wanted to thank you for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. It's a wintry day in the neighborhood. The forecast today is for a wintry mix, but we've already got some light snow on the trees. It's quite beautiful. The roads are still clear, so we are good to go. I wanted to talk today a little bit about the role that contradiction plays in creating conditions for conflict that we find ourselves in all the time. And I'll take you back to an example, a little bit of a silly example perhaps, from my high school days, where peer pressure and playing practical jokes or just being a little bit of disruptive, bending the rules, if you will, was always kind of valued by my colleagues, my friends, my peers. And so I never was one to kind of participate, but on this particular day I figured, all right, maybe I'll join in. And so I was walking back from lunch, and I had a handful of raisins in my hand, and somebody said, why don't you toss those raisins into the crowd while we're walking back from lunch to get to class. And so I was walking down the hallway debating, should I do this? Should I not do this? And I think ultimately the peer pressure prevailed. It was like, what do I have to lose? And so I, took the raisins in my hand and just sort of innocently threw them behind me into the crowd that was walking. And of course, as luck would have it, it turned out that my principal was right behind me and got a hair full of raisins, and kind of came up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, that probably wasn't a great thing to do. Why don't you go pick up all those raisins? And of course I was totally embarrassed by that. And I think I made more of a scene for myself as being the center of attention than, the tossing of the raisins and the impact that might have had. And, I was sort of kicking myself after the fact for having done that. So, what's the point of that? Well, I think, one of the things that I would point out again in this relatively light example is that we are always challenged, I think, with contradicting values or ideas or things that we should do or we shouldn't do. And we get into these situations where, perhaps sort of our prevailing point of view is not to do something because we have, again, a value that's associated with that, not right or wrong. And we're sort of being challenged or put in a position to do, the opposite. And, in this case, it wasn't a comfortable thing for me to think about doing. And after the fact, it was even less comfortable to sort of contemplate the aftermath. It was harmless, but, from a personal standpoint and from an image standpoint, that was the last thing that I wanted to have happen. So, again, use that example. Think about everyday situations now that you're in where these conflicting, contradicting values, beliefs, expectations, all the things that are in our heads that either we have put there or more likely have been sort of imposed upon us through teaching and, conditioning, traditions, all the things that I've mentioned, create situations where you say one thing perhaps, or you think one thing, and you do something completely opposite. So some other examples that come to mind for me, as far as sort of everyday occurrences is, something, again, relatively benign, where somebody, you, me, anybody will have sort of a nutritional focus. And, these days, particularly among my kids, but, again, I would say across the board, there's a big focus on macros and, eating the right things and assessing what food is good for you and what isn't, and avoiding, this and, taking supplements and all those kinds of things. And again, think about a scenario where, you may be sort of the nutritional evangelist, and you're basically saying, do this, and, this is a good thing to do and whatnot. And then, at some point, you have a craving for something like going to McDonald's or, getting some kind of fast food, where part of you is going, this is certainly not aligned with my nutritional educational mantra that I'm sharing with everybody, but you come up with, a rationale that says, well, I'll just do it once, or, I eat healthy, so, I can do this. And again, it's not right or wrong, but we create a justification, and lo and behold, you get your fast food fix or whatever it is. And, you enjoy it in the moment, or what I think commonly happens is you kind of finish your meal and then you go, that was just not worth it. I shouldn't have done that. Not worth the calories. That's a common phrase I always hear. And now you feel, again, in conflict. I shouldn't have done that. And next time that'll never happen again. And of course it happens again, because we always find, a reason to circumvent whatever the primary rule is that we have for ourselves. And, you can think of, again, examples at work, or, just in social settings where, take hand washing, for example. I think nobody would disagree that hand washing is probably a good thing if you're taking care of patients, and when you go between patients, that, any provider or caregiver should wash their hands. And when I go to clinic, on occasion, I've been there a couple of times over the past year. I have my clinic visit, which is fine, and then I get prompted with an email survey where, for this particular institution where I'm getting my care, the only question that comes up for patient satisfaction is, did your provider wash their hands in your presence, yes or no? And that's the only question. And, to be honest, I'm not even really watching that, because, I'm assuming that people are washing their hands. And, the expectation is you should wash your hands. But the fact that we're doing the survey basically tells you that we're not washing our hands consistently. And the same thing applies, if you go to restaurants, you go to a restroom in a restaurant, there's always a sign, or usually a sign, that says employees must wash their hands before going back to work. So again, there's a rule in place because we know we're not doing it, and we all know we should, but there's always some rationale that comes up for us that allows us to make an exception, right? And that creates conflict, either for the one who's doing it, or for, the patient or the customer who has to be on the receiving end of the non-compliance, if you will. And then finally, you can look at it in sort of the more extreme settings where, conflict becomes dangerous. And, think about the conflict, like, I would say probably most religions, but certainly Christian religion, has, the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, or love your neighbor as yourself, those kinds of commandments, where we routinely make exception to that at the political level or at the national level for security purposes, or even in societal levels where, think about how many different ways killing somebody is classified. You have murder, which is intentional with malice. You have manslaughter, which is unintentional or, with less maliciousness. We have warfare conditions where it's justified because we're protecting the values of our nation or whatever it is. And, when we hit a target, like think about all the conflicts that are going on right now in the war in the world, whether it's Middle East or South America, we're always hitting justified targets, killing, certain individuals in the name of, again, security and what's right. And yeah, oh, by the way, we have collateral damage. Other people get killed in the process, but that's okay. So, again, not making a judgment as to whether things are right or wrong overall, other than to just see how we constantly find ourselves in contradiction. And the way that we manage our conflict is to find some rationale for why we can deviate from whatever the value we have is that stands as primary, or how we just deviate from, what I would say is just correct. So think about that. Look about, again, how you view things during your day, and how we're always confronted with things where we have something that we think should be happening that isn't aligned with what's going on, or there are circumstances where whatever we think we should be doing, we can't do or don't want to do, and then we come up with a reason for not doing it and follow through with the alternative action. And then generally we feel pretty bad about it after the fact. And that's how we basically go through our lives, and everybody's doing it, again, pretty much without noticing it, or just basically saying, well, that's the way we work. That's the way it is. So that's it for today. I'll leave you with one more beautiful view here of some snow-covered trees. I hope you all have a wonderful day and a great week. And I look forward to our next Inwyt Walkabout next week. This is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. Take care.